Alright, this is the last episode that covers material from the original show, so hopefully going forward I can just talk about Ice Queendom on its own after this, but in the meantime, I have some bitching to do because this episode mostly sucks. Okay, so this episode follows the story of the latter half of Season 1 of RWBY, but cuts out all of the John-focused episodes. And for those of you who did not like those episodes, I hate to tell you this, but them not being here actually makes this worse, not better. So we start with Team RWBY having decorated their room, and they go to class. Just like in the original show, the first class is with Professor Port and is about Grimm. RWBY is having a hard time staying awake in class, and when Port asks if anyone wants to test their skills in battle, Weiss steps forward. The fight goes the same as the original, and then class ends. RWBY tries to talk to Weiss, and Weiss walks away. Yang wants to get involved, but Blake holds her back and sounds a lot like Ty from episode 1. Then Weiss talks to Professor Port, and RWBY talks to Ozpin, which is almost the exact same as the original. You know, despite how often I have to say that, they still managed to do it worse than the original in many ways. Anyways, Ozpin tells RWBY that no one will follow a leader who isn't trying their best, and that she needs to reflect on that. And we also skip the line about how it's only been one day, showing that both Weiss and RWBY are overreacting to everything going on. Meanwhile, Port tells Weiss that she needs to be the best possible person she can be instead of trying to be a leader. Then we cut over to another class where John is fighting Carden and Weiss is staring at Pyrrha instead of focusing on the class, which is the same thing RWBY was doing earlier, and that bugged Weiss, so I guess we can add hypocrite to the list of personality traits here. RWBY then looks at Weiss thinking Weiss was staring at her instead, and RWBY makes sure her cheering on John isn't a problem. Speaking of John, he gets his ass kicked. Then we see he has the thorn pattern on his neck like Weiss, and that it's growing. Then the talk between John and Pyrrha about aura happens on the dormitory roof, which makes no fucking sense since they still keep in Pyrrha unlocking John's aura, and he clearly has aura during the class with Carden and also during the previous episode. Also, Weiss is the one who eavesdrops on the conversation instead of Carden. Weiss figures that she will get more points by supporting RWBY rather than trying to take her place, which is what Port told her. Also, what fucking points is she talking about? Is she talking about grades? Weiss also still thinks that RWBY is a shit leader. Then we cut over to the girls' room and RWBY doing some late night studying, and Weiss getting her some coffee so she can continue. Minor nitpick here, but Weiss knows how RWBY takes her coffee, and in the original, Weiss asked RWBY how she took her coffee. And since that interaction doesn't happen here, it makes me wonder if Weiss is psychic in this version. Weiss also says, "I know you will be a good leader at this point," and that line makes me realize that the pacing for these episodes is no better than the original show. I think the original had problems between characters resolved way too quickly, but Ice Queendom is doing the exact same thing. And if Weiss goes back on that line later, it will only prove that the characters are inconsistently written in this. Then we cut over to John going to bed and him staring at his hands while thinking about his aura, when another version of him appears and starts saying John's fears and doubts out loud. Then it cuts to morning where John isn't waking up, and at first the rest of Team Juniper thinks it's nothing until Pyrrha checks his aura and figures out something is wrong. They strip him down to the waist, and the thorn pattern is now everywhere on his chest and back. Everyone shows up to check on John, and wait, what is Team RWBY doing here? All the scenes with RWBY talking with John got cut, and the only other person to interact with him is Weiss, who literally left him hanging. Anyways, we get more of Shion, and they explain that they are a super special kind of hunter who fights a particular type of Grimm called nightmares, which are Grimm that get inside a person and feed on their aura to reproduce. Shion also says that only the close friends of the victim may enter their dream to defeat the Grimm and save them, which of course means that no one in the room could count, seeing as how the vast majority of the screen time has been dedicated to RWBY, and Team Juniper has interacted almost not at all. Oh, no, wait, they're good to go for some reason. I guess we're going with them being friends despite them not showing it. Anyways, using a dreamcatcher, Shion sends the rest of Team Juniper in, and we see the nightmare that the nightmare has created to mess with John, which is a bunch of bunny statues, his armor and sword talking shit to him, and he's in his pajamas while he takes on more rabbit-like features. I'm sorry, but what the fuck? No, really, what the fuck is this supposed to be? I get that it's a dream and dreams tend to be weird, but there is no reason for them to be this weird. Anyways, they get John out in like 3 seconds because John's aura is small, and so the thing had little to feed on. Team Ruby then talks about how they need to be on guard, and if anyone is emotionally compromised, to talk about it so the Grimm will have a harder time getting them. Then White suggests they go into town because a festival is coming up, and Ruby, who is native to the area, has apparently never heard of this festival. Then we get the scene with the dust shop robbery and the beginning of Weiss and Blake's conflict. Okay, so as much as I've been shitting on the series so far, I have to admit that the conflict between Blake and Weiss is so much better in Ice Queendom. Weiss's position is much clearer now, and she has a hatred of all faunus for the pain and suffering the White Fang has caused her and her family. On the other hand, Blake, having been with the White Fang, actually knows that the faunus who have resorted to violence are misguided and not representative of the whole organization. And Ruby even points out that the robbers she dealt with were human and not faunus. Of course, this scene won't matter if they don't cover the events of Volume 2, but whatever. Anyways, then we get Sun running past the girls and Weiss wanting to capture him to prove how bad he is. Then the scene with Penny happens, and it's pretty close to the original, just with all the comedy removed. But Yang does get a good line about how Weiss needs to stop talking about the White Fang organization and not to be a bigot, since we are talking about an individual here. Then we get the talk between Blake and Sun, which goes exactly like the original, except that Sun isn't all goofy and awkward. Ruby is all alone with Penny, who asks if they are looking for the faunus, and Ruby asks how Penny knows. And we get this stupid line, "I saw her with it off," referring to Blake's bow. And Ruby asks when, but then we cut to Yang and Weiss. I'm sorry, but if that was supposed to be funny, it's not. It's a legitimate question, and the original did a better job showing how Penny knew that Blake was a faunus. Yang interrogates Weiss, trying to figure out how much of Weiss is an act, and Weiss has a breakdown because nothing is going her way. I'll talk about this more in the character section, but I fucking hate this. Then we cut back to the docks where Blake and Sun are about to interrupt the White Fang before cutting back to Yang and Weiss. Weiss says that Yang spoils Ruby, so she is always showing off, and Yang accepts this before pointing out that Weiss needs to shut up and actually be a good friend instead of saying that she is a good teammate. And then we get the fight scene at the docks between the White Fang, Blake, Sun, and Penny. Oh, no, wait, I was thinking about the original. Instead, they skip that entirely and cut to the aftermath, where Weiss tells Blake she doesn't care about Blake's past association to the White Fang, and wants Blake to talk to her and her teammates instead of to a stranger. Just like in the original. Except it doesn't work here, and I'll explain here soon why that is. Then the credits start to roll, but we get an end credit scene showing Weiss being trapped by the nightmare. This episode is just as bad as the previous one, and exists to set up the real plot of this show. So instead of them just jumping into the story they wanted to tell in the first place, they did a shit recap of a whole season of another show. Thanks for wasting time when you could have skipped it, you morons. Okay, so I have to talk about Weiss here. See, by this point in the original series, she was learning to be a better person and by extension a better team member. She had gotten over not being on Pyrrha's team, not being the leader, and even some of her issues with the faunus. But here, when she has her breakdown, it's clear that she isn't over any of it. Even the nightmare version of herself says at the end that she will never be able to forgive the faunus. So they keep in these scenes from the original, but then basically show Weiss not having progressed or learned from these moments like she did in the original. She basically is still a spoiled rich girl with a lot of issues. This is why I called her a bitch last episode, because at least the original Weiss was capable of learning from her mistakes and grew as a person, even if it was way too fast. Here she just feels like she's in a holding pattern of never growing just so they can have an excuse for the dreamscape stuff. And then Weiss has the fucking audacity to say that Yang spoils Ruby? The reason why Ruby was showing off earlier was that she wanted to show Weiss that she was capable and didn't need to be looked after. Not to mention, we haven't seen Yang spoil Ruby. She's just been a good big sister and even has been letting Ruby do things on her own and trying to help her come out of her shell. So yeah, Weiss is still a bitch, and I bet this is going to continue until we get to the dreamscape sequence that's going to end up taking up probably the rest of this fucking show. Speaking of dreamscape shit, let's talk about Shion. So, how do I feel about the character now that we've actually gotten to see them doing something? Honestly, my major complaint is very similar to a lot of the other characters in the show, is that they have almost no character to speak of. They show up and act like a plot device to fix a problem and introduce something that is barely relevant in the plot of this episode, except as a way of introducing something to the audience so that it can be elaborated on later. I hate the idea of a huntsman or huntress who specializes against one type of Grimm, as they would be entirely useless against most Grimm, Shion being a particularly bad case. face, especially since the fucker uses a dream catcher, which is fine against the nightmare, but would be bad against just about everything else. Also, can we even call them a hunter since they only facilitate others entering into a dreamscape to fight the Grimm? Shion only gets involved once the Grimm leaves the body, and the show doesn't explain why locking the thing in a jar is more useful than just stabbing it or shooting it. It just feels like a huge contrivance for the rest of the story. If this concept was in any other show, I wouldn't mind, but in RWBY it feels off, and I'm not really sure how to explain it aside from how I already have. Other than that, no one else here grew as a character or had anything significant happen, so I'm just gonna bitch about the animation now. Okay, starting off, animation errors. Blake has her bow behind her head in an early scene, which would be fine if the ears the bow was meant to cover were on the back of her head, but they aren't. Also, not sure if this is an error or not, but for some reason, when they show Blake sleeping early in the episode, she has her eyes open. The animation showing Shion creating what they need for dealing with the nightmare is beautiful, and if it were any other show, I would be lavishing the animation with praise, but I still think it feels out of place in RWBY. While the symbolism of the dreamscape makes no sense, it does look good, but the cuts between in the dreamscape and out makes the animation that follows make no sense. The statues in the dreamscape are falling over and a vine appeared without showing where it came from, which is just lazy. The animation of Team Juniper falling towards John is also really weird looking, especially since their faces just have a generic happy look to them and they fall so slowly. I wish they'd make it clear if the dreamscape can have wonky physics because of the nature of dreams. And I'm so sick of these generic faces they keep putting on the cast. It's like every other scene they have a shot where one of the girls has their mouth hanging open in surprise, and it makes me want to force their mouth shut because it just looks so dumb. And the glassy, doll-eyed expressions aren't really helping either. I'm not going to repeat my issues with the running animations, I'm just going to say that they haven't gotten any better and move on. There is more of a feeling of weight and impact when it comes to strikes and people falling, but it still feels lackluster compared to other shows. Weird thing during the scene at the cafe, why does Sun have a full meal in front of him? Like, Blake has her coffee or tea and so does he, but he also has a full meal. I don't know, it just seems kind of weird. There's only one fight scene in this episode, and it's just like the RWBY vs. Thugs fight in the first episode. It's visually messy. This one is between Weiss and a Borbatusk, which is a boar Grimm. It goes the same as the original, just shorter. One of the weird things about this fight is that they gave the Grimm spit and drool, which I've never seen a Grimm have before. It just goes against the nature of Grimm as soulless monsters when you start giving them these kinds of features. Like, they already look evil and act evil. Why would you need to add more on top of that? Less is definitely more in this case. They also give the animation around Weiss's glyphs more visual flair, but it just feels extra and just clutters the screen. Similar to how I described the fight between Ruby and the Goons with Ruby's cloak. They also make the Grimm have blood spray out from the wound, which again, I've never seen from a Grimm before. I didn't even think they had blood, so it seems that they forgot details about the setting, which makes the animation look inconsistent. Also, the Grimm disappears almost immediately on death, which the previous Grimm disappears slowly, like in the original series, so again, the animation looks inconsistent. At least the music for the fight doesn't suck, so it has that going for it. But yeah, that's episode 3, the last of the recap episodes, and thank fuck we are done with those. Because honestly, this has been a Volume 1 recap speedrun of any percent, which is bullshit. We didn't need these episodes. We could have just started with the story they wanted to tell, and then have a brief description of the events of the first season. Instead, we got this shit. Hopefully the actual story they wanted to tell will be good, but I have no faith in this series.